Welcome to OECD Podcast, where policy meets people.
September 2021 has brought a very literal back to school in most OECD countries. Many students are returning to in-person learning at last, after months of classes taught partially or entirely online. School closures have been significant across the OECD, with 55 in-person learning days lost, on average, for pre-primary school children, and as many as 100 days lost, on average, for high school students. So what has the impact been on young people's learning and well-being? Which groups of students have been the most affected by closures? And what are the long-term implications for both individuals and countries? I'm Kate Lancaster, and you're listening to OECD Podcasts. To answer these questions and to discuss what countries can do to strengthen equity in education, I'm speaking with Marie-Helene Doumet, Senior Analyst for Education and Skills at the OECD. Welcome, Marie-Helene, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Kate.
So, we know the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on education has been huge. Can you walk us through the key numbers?
Yes, sure, Kate. So more than 1 year into the COVID pandemic, close to half the world's students are still affected by partial or full school closures. Now, of course, a number of school lockdown days, so what I mean by that, when schools were fully closed, and here we're not counting holidays, periods or weekends or anything, but the number of actual instruction days where schools were closed, vary differently across countries, but also across education levels. And what we find is that schools closed for longer periods of time at higher levels of education. So for example, between the start of 2020 and until May 2021, pre-primary schools were closed for about 55 days on average, compared to more than 100 days at upper secondary level.
So high school.
Yes, high school. So if we want to bring this back relative to the number of hours students would have normally spent in school, on a full year, this represents around 28% of total instruction days for pre-primary children, but more than half of their instruction days for high school children.
And so that means not that those 50% of days was completely lost, there was no education happening, but that it wasn't happening in person.
Yes, exactly. Schools shut down, but students didn't stop learning. They just shifted the learning to happen at home. Almost all schools across OECD countries closed down. But if we look at what happened in 2021, we see that the situation is quite different. And most schools closed for shorter periods of time in 2021 than in 2020.
How have different students been affected? Has everyone been affected in the same way by school closures and this shift to more online learning?
We can already see, if we take from the perspective of an education level, pre-primary education, there's been a lot of focus on that, particularly to keep them open. And there are different reasons why many countries have really insisted on keeping them open as much as possible. The first one is that there is a strong recognition and awareness now of the importance of the early years for children's cognitive, social, and emotional skills. The second reason is that distance learning is just very difficult for children at such a young age. They can't sit still in front of a computer screen, and it's probably not desirable for them to do so. I mean, we would not want our children to stay in screens for hours on end, neither, particularly when they're so young. And the third reason is also, when confinement started to alleviate a bit and people started returning to work, having children go back to school was really essential to allow their parents to return to work. Another level that has also been hardly hit, I would say, is vocational education and training. And there are two reasons for that. One of the first reasons is that this is a very practically oriented program.
Very hands-on.
Yes, very hands-on. And while the theoretical component of vocational education can, of course, happen online, all the practice, the field-based work, all that is very challenging. The other issue with vocational education is that a lot of them are based on, have a work-based component where they need to go in an enterprise and work for some time there, but with COVID and with the economic situation, a lot of those were not able to provide the apprenticeships that they usually do.
We talk a lot about the digital divide, but I'm wondering how that translates for children and for young adults.
We talk a lot about the digital divide. Students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or from less well-off families, they might not have the connectivity in place to connect remotely to distance learning. And even when they do, their connections might not be stable enough. They might also not have a quiet place at home to study. So all this impacts their learning environment, which really isn't effective for quality learning to take place. Beyond that, also, learning from home requires a certain set of other skills that perhaps are not taught so much within the school. Being able to learn on your own, autonomy. Also perseverance and commitment. It's not easy to focus in front of a screen. And to manage your own time and to know when you need to connect, when you need to study, when you need to do your homework. So all that also, I think children who already had a hard time engaging with education in school will probably find it even more difficult when they're less guided at home.
Well, it's interesting what you say, the challenges that were already there, because while it's true that these differences and inequalities are quite striking, I think this is something the OECD has been drawing attention to for a long time now, that the fact that we need to aim for equity in educational opportunities.
Yeah, these inequalities have always been there. The OECD Program for International Student Assessment, what we refer to as PISA, provides information on students' performance when they're 15. So this is usually at the end of compulsory education. It also looks at how their performance varies across a number of various equity dimensions like gender, socioeconomic status, the country of origin, just to name some. And what we find is that across these dimensions, socioeconomic status is the one that affects students' performance the most. So what we see, for example, across OECD countries is that the share of students that achieve PISA level 2, this is the minimum level that we expect adults to attain, at least to be able to lead fulfilled lives.
And can I just interject? PISA measures skills in reading and science and mathematics.
Okay, so here I'm referring to reading scores. So the share of students that achieved at least PISA level 2 in reading, that come from the lowest socioeconomic background, is around 30% lower than the share of students that reach this level from the highest socioeconomic background.
So even before the constraints and challenges posed by COVID, we were already seeing quite a striking difference.
Yes, exactly. Now, some countries were better simply at achieving equitable outcomes. So, for example, this was the case in Canada, Estonia, or Finland, where the difference is less than 15% between those from the most advantaged families and those from disadvantaged families. It's extremely high. If we take the case of Brazil or Mexico, this difference is more than 50%.
So what do you think the long-term impact could be?
The most immediate impact is that they are likely to learn less. If they're likely to learn less, those that already had trouble engaging in school before the pandemic will have even more difficulty doing so quickly, and that they will disengage even further. They might even drop out from education altogether. And of course, the risk of not having upper secondary education means that this might have a longer term impacts on the economic and labor market outcomes of individuals. The employment rate of those that don't have an upper secondary education is 20 percentage points below those that have a university degree. And they also earn less. But even going beyond the money, it's not just about employment, it's not just about earnings. Many social outcomes as well associated with higher education, for example, better health, more involvement in community, in government, also being more connected to other people. And we find that the higher educational attainment people have, the more likely they are to engage in these other activities.
So this is a lot of pressure for this back to school. What do we need to do to improve equity in education, both now and as the pandemic eases?
There will be another number of things that would need to be done. So first, I would say the countries have done a great job in really ramping up investment in education to help the education response for the pandemic. 2/3 of countries increased funding in 2020, more than 3/4 of them did so in 2021. So this is very positive. But it will be really important to help sustain this investment in the future. And it's not so much how much is spent that is important, but also how we spend it, and how countries spend it, to make sure that learning is effective and it's efficient. I would focus perhaps on three elements. The first one is making sure that we invest in the early years. So this is extremely important. We have evidence that shows that those who attend early childhood education and care are more likely to perform later in school and in life, and also to acquire the solid foundations, the social and emotional skills that will then carry them as well throughout their lifetime. The second one is investing in teachers. We've seen with the pandemic that a lot of teachers were not trained, in terms of ICT, did not have the digital skills to shift so quickly, to digital learning. But again, during the pandemic, many countries have quickly provided services to help teachers, rise up to this task. And finally, the last one I would say is to invest in adult learning. We're living unprecedented times. The world is changing at such a pace that adult learning is really crucial to make sure individuals can adapt to the changes and develop new skills throughout their career as the world evolves. And this is really important, for all adults, the high-skilled ones and those in low-skilled occupations as well. In high technology sectors, workers need to update their competencies to be able to, keep pace with the changing techniques. In low technology sectors, it's more the risk of automation and losing their job. So they need to reskill as well. So it really impacts all adults. But what we see is that still only half of 25 to 64-year-olds participate in some form of formal or non-formal learning before the pandemic.
By formal, you mean like signing up for a certification course or a training in a classroom, and informal is more on the job or with colleagues or training provided at work?
Formal is a recognized credential from an institution, and non-formal would be, for example, a training that's developed by a company, for example, that you would do within your workplace.
And you said only about 50% of kind of prime age workers participate in either one of those kinds of training. Do we know anything about which kinds of workers are more likely to participate?
So those with high skills are more likely to participate in some form of adult learning. Those that already have a higher education degree are more likely to participate than those that don't. Also, the young are more likely to participate than older adults as well. So yes, there is work that needs to be done to promote adult learning to those that need it the most. We actually look at the data on barriers to adult learning and find that the top 3 reasons reported for not engaging in some form of adult learning, they relate to either cost, schedule, or family barriers, particularly when it comes to women. Or family reasons, so taking care of children, and that's where we see where perhaps during the pandemic what happened is that all 3 of those were suddenly hit. I mean, people had less time because they were juggling so many different tasks. Family reasons also increased quite, particularly for those who had children at home and tried to combine work with homeschooling, and then cost as well with the economic crisis, so that also was a factor. And so what we see is that participation dropped by about 27% in EU countries, second quarter of 2020 compared to 2019.
And to me, that's very striking because we've also have OECD data about the kinds of jobs that have been most affected by COVID, and a lot of them are mid or low skilled jobs. And these are the same kind of people and positions where people are not having access to training.
Yes, I mean, the sectors that were most affected by COVID were the hospitality sectors, the tourism sectors. In contrast, though, but there was a lot of creation of opportunities as well. So there was more demand in the health sector. There was a lot of demand also in the digital sector. So jobs for computer programming skills that also rose during the pandemic. So it's a question about being able to reskill,
exactly,
adapt, and
to continue learning throughout your life, but to have the opportunity to do that and the means.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the good news is that data from the third and fourth quarter of 2020 already suggests that participation rates would have increased.
That is good.
Yes, so there is some good news.
Another thing that when we're thinking about jobs and skills and learning from the pandemic that has been very striking to me is the reminder it gave us of how important many jobs that we might describe as vocational are, the frontline service jobs, the frontline health worker jobs. And I was wondering if you have anything to share with us on that.
The pandemic has definitely brought to the forefront all of these vocational jobs. They were all considered essential services, most of them. During the pandemic, they were the only ones who were keeping society afloat while everyone was confined. There's probably an opportunity here as well, as we think about the lessons that we learn from the pandemic that we want to carry over with us. Is that vocational education was traditionally considered as something you wouldn't go to directly on your own, but more something that you, for example, if you didn't perform well academically, then you would go down that route. And many countries as well have neglected vocational education for a number of years, focusing a lot of their efforts on developing higher education. But it is something probably with the pandemic, we do see that it has restored a bit of the attractiveness of some of these vocational professions. And there is an opportunity here perhaps to raise the attractiveness, do have more efforts in terms of informing individuals so that going into these pathways is not just one of last resort. We have data in education at glance that we often show, which is that the share of students without tertiary educated parents who go into tertiary education is very low compared to those who do have tertiary educated parents.
So if your parents have a university degree, you're more likely to go to university. And if they don't, you're not.
Yes, exactly. But the opposite is true for vocational paths. So if your parents don't have a tertiary degree, then you're more likely to go into vocational paths than if they did. But this says that often it's not a question of choice so much as just doing what you're used to and what you're used to seeing in your environment. And that's where there's probably a huge opportunity to highlight what vocational education is, the benefit it brings to society, to give students a choice, a real choice beyond just what they see in their households. It's not just making sure that disadvantaged students have the same opportunities as more advantaged ones. It's also making sure that everyone has the same opportunities and is aware of all of the opportunities so they can really make informed decisions about their pathways.
Well, thank you. And as we wrap up, are there any other lessons you'd like to share with our listeners?
I would say that COVID-19 it's caused a lot of disruption, it's caused a lot of suffering, of course. But we've also seen a lot of experimentation and a lot of innovation come out of it. And I think it's these that we should build on if we want to continue working towards more inclusion in education and society more generally. There's been very, very interesting developments around the world. Teachers and students have come together with parents, with business, with civil society to try and help students learn, give them access to digital materials. I think the interaction between teachers and students became closer as well during confinement, and teachers as well were more empowered as well to focus on those students which they felt needed it the most. So I think it's those lessons that we can carry forward with us as we continue to build stronger out of this pandemic.
Marie-Helene Doumet, thank you very much for speaking with us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
To learn more about the issues we've been discussing today, go to oecd.org/coronavirus/en/education-equity.
To listen to other OECD podcasts, find us on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud.com/OECD.